Good afternoon, everyone. This is Peter Stanton. I'm the publisher of the Worcester Business Journal and your moderator for today's session on HR strategy, contingency planning during the crisis. Whether you're managing a remote workforce, working with employees who are at work now, or planning to bring others back to the workplace, we're going to be digging into a lot of the details of how HR professionals and company owners are dealing with these issues. This program is part of our ongoing COVID-19 webcast series on best practices for managing through the crisis, and is made possible through the support of our series sponsors, Webster 5 and Fallon Health, and by this HR strategy session sponsor, Bowditch. They're all community-minded organizations who are pitching in to help the Central Mass community get through this crisis together. And this webcast is able to be broadcast for free, as well as posted to our website for additional views and sharing of documents because of their generous support. In addition, each organization has made an expert from their company available to share their expertise and perspective on managing your workforce today. And so our speakers are from each of our sponsoring organizations. With us today on our panel are Brian Mullen, who is a partner at Bowditch & Dewey. Hey, Brian.
Good afternoon.
And Terry Flynn, who is a Senior VP and Director of Human Resources with Webster 5. Hi, Terry.
How are you?
Good. And our third panelist is Jill LeBeau, who's a Senior VP and Chief Human Resource Officer for Fallon Health. Hey, Jill.
Hello. Hello, Peter.
So our first presenter this afternoon is going to be Brian Mullen, who will give us the legal framework we all need to have in mind when dealing with COVID-19 workplace issues. Brian is a former member of the Marine Corps, and his practice area at Bowditch is in labor, employment, and higher education law. Brian, it's all yours.
Thank you. What I'm going to talk about a little bit today is to give an overview, particularly of issues in the workplace that have been coming to the fore with respect to compliance, as well as monitoring your workforce in general, and some issues that have come up as potential questions of liability with managing your workforce during these exemplary times. Could change the slide, please? The first thing that I think a lot of people have been talking about lately is both information that's come out from OSHA and the CDC concerning meeting your obligation as an employer to provide a safe and healthy workplace for your employees. This extends not only to your regular places of work, but also to, if people are working remotely or otherwise, potentially issues with their remote locations. I'm going to talk about some of the basics of the obligation to maintain the safe work environment, and some issues that have been addressed as far as the minimums or basics that you should be engaged in with respect to COVID-19 in the workplace. In the last 2 months or so, OSHA has not issued any new standards or regulations with respect to general industry on safety in the workplace. However, they have made clear frequently that all employers have a general duty to maintain a safe workplace. And that means to observe and identify potential threats in the workplace, things that include workplace-related illnesses like potentially COVID-19, and have made recommendations in conjunction with the CDC on what employers can do to meet their obligation and to continue safe operations of the business. The primary issue here is planning, preparation, and response for your particular workspace. The guidelines I think that they have provided are fairly, I don't want to say obvious, but I think people are familiar with them now. It's looking at your workplace and making decisions about both your structure of your work, your physical workplace, and your staffing to identify how you can reduce potential issues of infection with COVID-19. The very basics are, again, many people have already done some of these, looking at their workforces, who can work remotely, decreasing, the number of workers in the workplace, as well as customers, with essentially effectuating a social distancing within the workplace. Increased cleaning and sanitization of the workplace, providing face masks, and limiting unnecessary access to the workplace and controlling access. These are just the basics to basically minimize contacts between employees and customers or others in the workplace. The key to this issue in compliance with what's been laid out to meet the your general duty, is it's expected that you're going to be flexible and that you're going to anticipate and expect changes. So as the situation with COVID-19 changes or evolves, you can't have a static idea of what you have done is going to be sufficient. You're going to need to continue to evaluate. Things change if you have a worker or even a customer that you become aware of who has been infected. You may need to, again, go back and take a look at how you're operating the workplace, and what you may need to do, given the current circumstances, to be able to take your best efforts to maintain a safe workplace for your employees. I did include a link here to OSHA publication that gives some details on issues on how to evaluate your workplace, which I think is useful, as well as the link that the information that there was developed with and in conjunction with the CDC. Next slide. I think there are some very basics here. The first is, if you have an employee or someone in your workplace who is sick, they should stay home. Along with the guidance from the CDC and from OSHA on how to keep workers safe and the workplace safe, there have also been some changes and guidance given from the EEOC concerning things like compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. But it has been made clear that monitoring your employees is a legitimate business interest at this point. So you can do things like taking employee temperatures, controlling travel, again, limiting interactions and contacts with others, and providing notices and tracking of infections. Again, if you become aware that an individual in your workplace has a sick family member, it is something you can ask about. You can ask your employees to identify whether or not they've been in an area of potentially higher risk for infection. You can also ask them if they or anyone else that they've been in contact with that they know of who is sick. And you can ask them to stay home. Generally speaking, this would be something that could potentially be limited under the ADA, but again, with the current circumstances, the regulatory agencies have made very clear that you can do these things. Bottom line, though, is that information about employees is confidential. So even if you're giving a notice of infection, which is appropriate to other employees when you find that someone may have been exposed or has been exposed to COVID-19, you should try to do so in a way that does not specifically identify the individual. Further, OSHA recommends that you keep a record of the temperature logs, things of that nature of individuals coming in. And again, the baseline temperature that is seen to raise an issue or a threat of potential infection is 100.3 degrees. So if you create those records, which you should if you're going to have this kind of assessment procedure in your workplace, again, that needs to be kept confidential. It should be treated it should not be part of a personnel file, and certainly should be kept in a secure place where only those with a specific need to know would have access. Next slide. Some of the issues that have come up in questions that I've had, and even in conversations with clients, have realized that there's some confusion out there. The workplace is very different now. You have people working at home, you have split shifts, reduced staffing, those kinds of things. Even reductions in pay or reduced hours or closings of businesses. you need to keep in mind wage and hour law when making these decisions and monitoring employees, particularly the distinction between exempt and non-exempt employees. And again, exempt employees are those employees who meet the limited requirements for a recognized exemption, and they do not have to be paid overtime or minimum wage, but they do have to be paid on a salary basis, meaning the minimum salary. That's where some of the issues have come in. Particularly with reduced hours schedules, you need to keep in mind that if you're reducing hours in a week, that does not reduce the pay of an exempt employee. They have to be paid the salary for any week in which they perform any work, unless they are taking time off for their own purposes. So with respect to exempt employees, it's important to keep that in mind, so that you could have an exempt employee off for a week, a whole week, and be able to not pay them the salary because they have not worked. But in order to do that, you also have to control and make sure that they aren't working, because if they do perform any work, you would be responsible for paying the entire salary for that week. Whereas hourly employees, they get paid for the time they work. The issues with them, when you have people who are dispersed, and as from my own experience and others, the workday is very different when you're working from home, with childcare issues and other issues that go on while you're at home that don't generally happen in the office. People are working broken days or other hours, or working late in the evening or early in the morning. And it's very important to make sure that you have accurate accounting of hours worked by non-exempt employees. Because if they're doing the work and you're getting the benefit of that work, they have to be paid. So it's very important to keep an eye on things like overtime, 40 in a week. All of these things are very, very important, specifically in Massachusetts, because quite frankly, the Massachusetts wage and hour law is draconian in its effect. It doesn't matter if you were trying to do the right thing and you never had a violation. If there's a mistake in pay, it's automatic treble damages, 3 times damages, and payment of the plaintiff's attorney's fees as well. So the costs, even for a minor error or accounting error on overtime, particularly if you spread it over a number of employees, can get to be very, very significant dollars very quickly. As to these issues, I have included a link that talks about particularly the salary basis and how exempt employees have to be paid from under the FLSA. Next slide. There are also pay and benefit issues depending on decisions you're making with your workforce. As we know, many people out there have already had to institute layoffs, closings for a period of time, and even furloughs of workers. An interesting issue is final pay, particularly under Massachusetts law. Questions have been raised as to whether or not an employee who's being furloughed, whether the employer then has to cash them out on their accrued but unused vacation and provide them their final paycheck. I've had some discussions with some investigators at the Attorney General's office recently about these issues, and the Attorney General basically takes a position that if it looks like a termination and it sounds like a termination, it's a termination, and in which case you have to make all those payments, and failure to do so, again, would be a violation of the Massachusetts Wage Act. So what does that mean in practice? If you're furloughing an employee, and this is the position of the Attorney General's office, if you're furloughing an employee, but an employee says, essentially, I'd rather be laid off, then that's an indication that there was an agreement on a furlough, that there was actually a termination. Same things with plant closings or office closings. If it's for a short duration, then it is likely not to be determined to be a termination, and you wouldn't have to pay out those benefits as a separation. However, if there's no end in sight or no end given or clear communication, you may very well have to treat it as a separation from employment. the best advice that I have is to make sure that you have clear communications and documented communication, things like furlough letters, closing letters, and even separation letters that explain what the terms are of this change in status for employees. They don't have to be extremely detailed, but it has to be clear so that both parties understand that it's not a termination, or in the case that it is a termination. One of the other issues that comes up, both with terminations and in some cases reductions in hours due to closings or layoffs, is benefits, particularly COBRA. And some clients have been confused about this. If you have to look at your insurance contracts, your contracts with your insurer, and look closely at the definition of a covered employee, because many times it's hours based. If what you're doing with a furlough or a closing or even changes in schedule is going to drop someone's hours below the level to be considered eligible to receive the insurance, you have to then treat them or give them the opportunity, assuming they're eligible, for to continuation of benefits in COBRA. Interestingly, the Attorney General's office takes the position that if benefits are not continued as they would be if the person were at work or working in the office, so to speak, then that's an indication that there's a termination. So the Attorney General's office, when weighing an issue or a question as to whether someone's employment has been terminated or whether they're just on a furlough status for a period of time, would be whether or not their employment benefits are being continued on the same terms and conditions as they were as when the individual was working actively. Next slide. Some questions that have come up, quite frankly, is to me several times, employers are concerned because they want to know if their workers' compensation coverage is going to protect them if they get a claim from an employee that they became infected as a result of being forced or told to come to work. Workers' compensation, again, is a sole source remedy, so that is insurance is available, and employers should check their insurance and make sure that they have valid and active insurance in place, because it does provide a great deal of protection for the employer. It also provides benefits that for the individual worker who may be sick or injured, particularly if they can contract COVID-19. The likelihood of an individual being able to bring a suit against an employer because they contract COVID-19 in the workplace is very limited if you have active workers' compensation insurance in place, because under workers' compensation, the grand bargain in that case for acquiring that insurance was that an individual who is injured and or becomes ill as a result of their employment can only look to the insurance coverage and benefits of workers' compensation as compensation for that injury or illness. Employment discrimination issues. The biggest issues here, as I see, is making sure that if you're making decisions about who's going to be recalled, who's not going to be recalled, who's going to be laid off, who's not, that you go through your risk assessment and again test your decisions based upon the needs of your business. Can you explain the difference between picking employee A to return to work and employee B not to return to work? You need to be able to identify legitimate business need for doing so. And if you can do that, you're probably in pretty good shape. The other thing that you want to do is you always want to go through a risk assessment looking at, is there some correlation between a protected class and the numbers of people that we're selecting for either termination or, again, some change in benefit or status. You need to be cognizant of that and to be able to demonstrate that process prior to making the decision. It, again, is my recommendation for you. Just a very quick couple of points on the potential liability issues with the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, particularly the expansion of FMLA and paid sick leave. As far as compliance issues and administration, for the expansion of FMLA, it is exactly that. It is basically another another reason or qualifying reason for someone to be able to take FMLA. All of the notices and all of the management, all of the administration issues are the same. It does not increase someone's 12-week entitlement to FMLA. Therefore, if someone has used up their FMLA, they may not have additional leave for the purposes of staying home to care for a child who otherwise is out of school or the parent needs to be there. They may not have that leave available. So it's the same thing as managing your regular FMLA. This is just an additional qualifying reason to take the leave. Under the paid sick leave is a little bit different because there are several different COVID-19 related bases for receiving paid sick time. And the bottom line is that the emergency paid sick leave portion of the law is basically grafted under the FLSA, which means if you fail to pay, or if you retaliate against someone, or if you in some way refuse to provide them the benefit, then that would be a wage and hour claim or under the FLSA. So those are the kinds of things that you need to keep in mind as far as structure when you're administrating leaves, and also making sure that you're doing things in the time that would be required both under the FMLA and the FLSA with respect to the two types of leave. Next slide. That's what I have as far as the overview. Back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Brian. That's a great overview. And we're now going to go to Terry Flynn. Terry is a Senior VP and Director of Human Resources for Webster 5, one of Central Massachusetts' leading community banks. Her expertise is in workforce planning and acquisition, training and employee engagement, as well as culture and change management. Boy, the culture is changing these days, isn't it? As a banker, Terry's managing workforce for an essential business with some of her team working remotely, others coming into the office or bank branches. Terry, it's great to have you with us and love to hear how your firm is coping and some advice you have for our attendees.
Great to be here, Peter. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to join you and Jill and Brian on this webinar. I'd just like to point out that in addition to what I'm going to say, we've listed some links to some very helpful resources throughout this time that we're living in. So just to give you a brief background, our bank employs approximately 150 employees. That's in 8 different facilities. And as you pointed out, as an essential business, we couldn't shut down. We didn't want to shut down. We had to service our customers, but we did have to move rapidly to change our operations and our staffing models. So we're fortunate. We had a very strong business continuity plan. We tested it on a regular basis. We already had a remote work program, an IT department that is unbelievably great at rapidly deploying safe technology, and most importantly, engaged and dedicated employees. Without everybody just pitching in and knowing we're all in this together, we wouldn't have been able to successfully continue our operations. So it's all about the talent and the technology. We had about 30% of our employees having remote work capabilities prior to the outbreak. When we changed our operations and our staffing models, we ended up with about 75% of our employees working remotely, and the 25% that remain on site are there to service our customers. So the actions that we took, we formed a task force and we looked at re-engineering our operations. On the retail side, we formed 2 teams of employees to ensure the fact that if anybody was exposed, we would be able to move in another team with minimal disruption to our services. We reduced the hours of our operations. We met with customers by appointment only or through the drive-up. Definitely instituted and implemented social distancing, provided PPE to our employees. Worked with facilities. They were fantastic in providing additional cleaning procedures, and redeployed talent whenever necessary. With the PPP loans in the first round, we processed approximately 300 loans, and it's really all different departments pitching in and helping out so that we can work on this together. The rest of our operations, 45% were new to remote work. So we worked on doing virtual training for our employees and our managers that were new to it. And of course, we were able to provide Zoom meetings and teleconference calls. Most importantly, though, we had a robust communications plan. On our intranet, we have a dedicated COVID-19 page. We send out emails, we hold virtual meetings. Communications, we do things such as new policies, the usage of PPE, telehealth, EAP information. So in terms of scaling up our operations today, looking forward into the reentry to the office, our considerations are very similar to what we did prior with the outbreak of COVID. We are forming a reentry team. We're reviewing workplace safety, looking at our stay-at-home requirements, providing PPE like hand sanitizers, working on social distancing, literally putting masking tape down on floors saying, please, this is a safe area. And really reviewing our common areas such as kitchen areas and what we can do to assist our employees in doing further social distancing. We're also looking at recall procedures. It's not going to be a turn of a light switch. We are looking at phasing in return to work, doing new staffing models, staggering teams, and of course, continuing remote work. We're going to do a workplace policy reboot. We had a remote work program in place, but for instance, when do we perform the work? Our employees were pretty much set on doing it 8 to 5. Well, perhaps now with childcare issues, you might be doing your work 7 to 9. We want to make sure that we can implement that in a policy that works well for all. Paid sick leave, emergency closings, leaves of absence, those are all workplace policy reboots that we're looking at right now. And of course, reviewing employee benefits such as 401k loans and dependent care. Most importantly, though, we're going to continue with our communications to our employees and to our customers. We're going to be as transparent and as reassuring as possible and as reasonable. And of course, provide lots of resources to our employees. Worcester Business Journal, Bowditch. There's companies, Hayes Companies, Lear Corporation, a lot of different resources out there that we can use. So again, I can't stress enough that it's because of our fantastic workforce, their resilience, their dedication, and everybody being in this together that we've been able to manage through this, and we are confident we'll be able to continue managing through this. Thanks, Peter.
That's terrific, Terry. I think, when we were talking earlier, you were saying this is where culture really gets tested. And, hopefully it's set up and it's strong. And it sounds like you're in that position. That's great. Just to remind everyone, again, these slides, you're looking at them. We're going to provide all of these with live links to everyone attending here today, and they'll be sent out in a post-webinar email. So that's true for Brian's, for Terry's slides, and also for what Jill's going to use. So Jill, let me introduce Jill LeBeau, the Senior VP and Chief Human Resource Officer for Fallon Health. Jill not only brings the perspective of an HR professional, but also represents one of our region's leading healthcare organizations. As a member of Fallon's senior management team, Jill is involved in developing HR strategies and navigating the organization's balance between at-home and at-work staff. Jill, I should note, was named one of Worcester Business Journal's Outstanding Women in Business in 2017, and she's still outstanding. So, Jill, nice to have you with us, and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
So thank you, Peter. Thanks to the Worcester Business Journal and to my fellow panelists, Terry and Brian. It's nice to be here today and hopefully, help others as they work through this challenging time. So similar to Terry, you have a slide here which gives you some resources. And the resources that I provided primarily focus on what Terry referred to as reentry, what we're calling at Fallon recovery. So I'll speak to, the experience we've had here at Fallon, and then I'll spend some time about where we are or on where we are in terms of planning our return to normal, if we're ever actually going to get back to what we would call normal. So Fallon Health is uniquely positioned during this healthcare crisis. We are a state designated essential employer. We also play an important role because we need to support our members and participants as a health insurer as well as a provider of care. One of our main focuses here at Fallon is providing care to seniors, which is a population that we all know is disproportionately impacted by this virus. Our programs for our seniors, a couple of them are aimed at keeping older adults, frail elders in particular, that are nursing home eligible. The goal of the programs is to keep them in their communities or in their homes versus in those facilities. So these people have complex care needs. So they're requiring quite a bit of attention right now, in addition to the support we're giving our members in all our programs. So I'm telling you all this just to emphasize how busy we are, right? So, and I know that's a different challenge than others might be experiencing if they've had to furlough or close their business. But our challenge has been that we're far busier than we are even under normal circumstances. And then because of the challenges posed by the virus, we had to find a way to get our work done and keep our 1,200 employees productive while changing where and how we work. And we had to do all of this while, keeping the legal parameters in mind, things like what Brian discussed, but also thinking through what the best decisions are for Fallon Health as an organization, our culture, our employees, and our members. And I think, in addition to communication, like Terry's saying, we're doing a lot of communicating. We're also trying to keep them engaged. We were fortunate too to have an engaged workforce because they're going above and beyond every day, despite the challenges they have now. And we want to keep them engaged. But part of that is making sure we make the right decisions by them. They're going to remember this, how it impacts them, how it impacts their families in years to come. So we have to be thoughtful about that because at the same time, we're also a business. So, we're constantly balancing, what are the business needs? How do we stay productive? But then how do we also meet our employees' needs in this trying time? So like many of you, when the pandemic started, we had to pivot and we had to pivot fast. We have a main office located in downtown Worcester where about 850 office workers sit. And then the rest of our 1,200 employees are spread throughout clinical sites. So they're providing care. What we did mid-March was we pulled about 800 of those office workers out of the building and we moved them home. Now we had some remote work capabilities in place. We have one of our programs where those employees primarily work from home. And then we had quite a bit of 1 day a week. We did not have a large percentage of full-time telecommuters. So the phenomenal work that our IT group did in that mid-March time period, it just really was incredible in terms of how they got everybody home so quickly. Equipment, connectivity issues, we had to increase our system capacity. It was really all hands on deck. Then we also had to work through the process of our clinical sites of putting all the safety precautions in place. How are we going to handle our members? We do have employees at those clinical facilities that work from home, but then also meet our members in the community. So our frail elders are still getting care, sometimes in their home, sometimes at an assisted living facility. So we have all those safety precautions in place. Then we also have the 50 people that are remaining in our office building. So everything you've heard already mentioned, the social distancing, the health screening, making sure, some people were moved in terms of where they sit, limiting the number of people in break rooms. Those things are already happening now for our limited employee base here, as well as at the clinical sites. So we moved everybody home. We went through what many people went through, and we felt like, we're maintaining operations. Now, are we 100% productive? Probably not everywhere, right? Because this is new for a lot of people. There's challenges with people, their personal situations in their homes, and we recognize that. We're not pushing people to operate at 100%. We know that they probably can't. But we felt like we had a handle on it. And so about 2 weeks ago, we had a cross-functional team that responded to the pandemic. We said, let's repurpose this cross-functional team. It's, multiple functions in the organization, IT, human resources, corporate relations, regulatory, clinical. We're fortunate, we're the size where we have those functions. And we said, let's make them a return to the office team. And we started reading some articles. There's some articles that are on this slide that are a little earlier than some of the more recent ones. And it talked about the phases and the configuration, and that was all, we were like, okay, this is good. But then as we were reading, and then as the advisory of the order became extended, it was really clear that this isn't a quick sort of return to the office switch and planning. When it is time, right? So part of what our committee is doing is putting together guidelines where we're monitoring, clinical guidance, state guidance, city guidance of when the right time is. But then we also have to figure out how do we bring in the right amount of people, and who is that, which functions. We have to think of things like possible discrimination claims on our decision making. And then of course, keeping people safe while they're here. 850 people in a downtown office building, we are a cube setting. We recently surveyed our employees. They're like, those are tight spaces. How are we going to do that? So we're in the process, and we're actually calling it midterm planning or recovery planning, of really understanding how we can get people back and what percentage people we're going to bring back. What will the building look like when we do that? Who should that be based on the work they perform and how successful they can be at home? And then we're recognizing we're still going to have people working at their homes a lot longer than we initially anticipated. And we're hearing from them, they're uncomfortable where they're sitting. They want their second monitor. Their wrists are sore because they don't have a regular keyboard, they're on a laptop. Oh, and by the way, schools aren't going to reopen. And what's going to happen with camps? So we have to, pretty quickly put together, as much information as we can for them, start to make decisions that address all of those issues at the same time. I'm ready to load everybody's ergonomic chairs from the office, put them in a van and start dropping them off, right? We spend money on those chairs for a reason. So that's some immediate planning we need to do, along with, the phased approach to coming back into the office. And then finally, something I mentioned to the panelists and to Peter and Chris at the Worcester Business Journal is one positive that we see about this for our organization is that we have shown we can successfully telecommute. And so we don't have an intention of ever bringing all 100% back into the building. So this has really given us tremendous information that we can use in terms of what we call space planning here, and really determining who needs to be in the office, who can be home, and what our real estate footprint looks like going forward. So we're keeping that in mind and noting things as we learn them and putting together a much longer term plan that will follow. And that's it.
Okay, Jill, thank you. Sorry, I just had to unmute there for a second. That's terrific. So I thought what we would do now is kind of jump right into the questions, and some of these get, as we anticipated, kind of specific. So I've got a good dozen questions and a few more have come in. So let me get right into them. First question, how do we keep confidentiality if we need to contact trace how one employee who might have infected other people? How is that maintained in that office setting?
Well, I can say to that again, it's obviously something that's tricky, but generally speaking, the direction is, in these cases, is to attempt to do the contract tracing from the infected employee's view, if you can. In other words, you're going to research, look at their schedule, where they've been working, depending if they've been traveling with others, those kinds of things, and if possible, to ask them who they interacted with within the previous 2 weeks, if you can, that far back. And then it's a matter of going to the other employees and individuals who they may have identified as having, or you have identified that they worked with maybe, or that they've identified, and informing them generally that they may have been in a position to have been in proximity to, or excuse me, they may have been in a position to where they may have been exposed to or potential COVID-19 exposure, and to give them directions again as to what to do for themselves at that point. There is some guidance from the CDC for an individual to look to as to what to conduct a risk assessment for themselves, as well as providing them, the employer providing them with insurance or otherwise, with time to go to see their doctor, those kinds of things. But again, the contact tracing is generally from the information received initially from the employee who may be infected, and then tracing back to others, but not disclosing the name of the infected employee.
Hey, Brian, just some clarity on the contact tracing. We've been reading about Massachusetts being a real leader in initiating this effort to contact trace. Is that something that we feel the company is responsible for, or is that something that should be handed off to the state, who's really taking that on as a direct responsibility?
Well, I think one of the things that the county may have, that will have to happen or will happen, is that individuals who are, COVID positive or infected, that information is going to the state through the Department of Health anyway. So the state is probably going to contact you and ask you for what information you have about a particular individual, so that the contract tracing can go in multiple directions, both inside and outside of the employment space.
Got it. So here's
So
a question.
Peter,
Yeah.
Peter, if you wanted to spend one more minute on this question.
Sure.
So we've had this, we've experienced it, and it is very similar to what Brian says. Each time you learn of someone, which we've been fortunate, it hasn't been that often, you do call the respective Department of Public Health. They talk to your employee at some point, you speak to your employee. We've shared with them, sort of the context we've learned the employee had, and they say, yeah, go talk to them. This is guidance you can send them. I have a really strong HR team that I partner with that works with me, and they're really leading these calls and working with the CDC. And then they also contact the other employees that we learn may have been potentially exposed.
Mhm.
The employees, they understand we can't tell them who. I remember I had one conversation several weeks ago where they were speculating a little, and I was like, really, this isn't something you want to speculate about. So, we're finding that most people are pretty respectful of it. And then sometimes I do think some of those potential exposures were also contacted by the Department of Public Health as follow-up.
Got it. Hey, so Terry, here's a question for you related to protective equipment. Is it the responsibility of the employer to provide that? And when it's masks, what is your standard? Is someone getting a new mask every day and throwing it away? Are they taking it home? How are you treating that issue?
Well, I think I'm going to just pass that over to Brian as our
Okay,
legal
sorry.
expert, if you don't mind.
No problem.
Well, thanks.
You're welcome.
I think it's because for me, from my perspective, it goes back to the OSHA duty, your general duty to provide a safe workplace, and that can include PPE. And again, that's different depending upon the kind of workplace. But assuming a general industry workplace, an office environment, or otherwise, having the requirement of people to wear face masks, I think, I know that there are different employers who have allowed people to bring their own, but also to issue them. But the point is to have some available, and there's a lot of information out there now about, what works and what doesn't, by the way, on those things. And I think in the workplace, it's a reasonable thing to require at this point, and an employer, to the extent they have the resources to provide the masks, whether they're homemade or bought, is something that employers should I think seriously consider making available, because I think it's going to become sort of a ubiquitous requirement here shortly.
Got it. So if someone, here's another question. If someone has a spouse or a family member who is, let's say, a nurse or a flight attendant, can they be treated, or can you require anything different from them than other employees? What direction do you give them around?
As far as whether they can be segregated in the workplace, that kind of thing?
I don't know if the question is clear. The
Okay.
question is, are they treated any differently because they may well have sort of, naturally greater exposure?
I think I'll take it on the front end from things like, can an employer, ask someone not to come to work because they may have been in a situation that indicates, a higher potential for infection? Yes, you can. You can also, again, with someone of that nature, you don't necessarily have to keep them out of the workplace if their job is one that can't be done remotely. That's where we talk about, reviewing and analyzing your workspace, and if you can, maybe segregate that person to a different part of your building or your facility to work to see if you're concerned about that kind of exposure. One of the other things, back to wage and hour issues, is you have to remember with exempt level employees who have to be paid, their salary for any week in which they perform work. If they're ready, willing, and able to work, and the employer is telling them you can't work today, they need to be paid their salary. So again, that's another issue to consider if you're going to have someone out of the workplace based upon their exemption status.
Okay. Here's another one. We are concerned with how to address those employees who continue to be afraid to return to the work operations, even though all safety precautions are in place. Jill, you might have faced that one already.
Yes, we do. We've faced it a few different times. We've dealt with it at the office. So if they were one of those 50 people that we needed to still keep coming in, we did have some that expressed discomfort despite the safety precautions. And then we've even had some employees in the clinical setting, who aren't necessarily in clinical roles, but in support roles, express that discomfort. It's challenging. It's probably one of the more challenging issues we've been dealing with. And what's mostly hard about it is we have the work available. So it's not even like we can just sort of furlough them, when they could get unemployment because they're uncomfortable. We have the work available. So we've worked in those situations where either we found them different work, so they've been redeployed. We've reduced hours if the different work isn't as much as the work, doesn't fill 40 hours if they've been scheduled for that. And then in a couple situations, people have chosen to go on a personal leave of absence, and we have allowed them to do that. We have to see how long that goes and how long we can support it before we might need to backfill them. And when they go on a personal leave of absence at Fallon, they get to maintain their benefits and they use their earned time.
Got it. Okay.
Just one point on that.
Yep.
I think Jill's view and handling of that is perfect from an HR perspective. As well as from a compliance perspective. But also the bottom line is that if you have work and you have an employee, if you have to have them in the workplace and there's no reason, they have no particular illness or a particular reason that qualifies for other kinds of leave, you can require that they come to work. I'm not necessarily advocating that. I'm just that the basis statement of the law is if we have work and you're our employee, if we ask you to come to work, you need to come to work. And again, I'm not suggesting that people should be out there terminating folks. They should be going through a process, I think, like Jill has talked about. But you certainly can tell the person that if there's a need for somebody to do that work and they're not willing to do it, that you might have to find somebody else for that position.
Got it. So it's 1:48, and I was wondering, I think we had said 1:45 for the session. I think we'll try and go to 1:55 if we can, just to get to the other questions that are in line. So here's one. Is it recommended, Brian, you had referred to, we talked about that tracing issue and how do you figure out where everybody's been without having their cell phone log, right, for a 2-week period. So the question is it recommended that everyone keep a daily log who they've interacted with, so that tracing could be easier should it come up?
I kind of maybe go to Jill and Terry on that. I mean, absolutely, you could ask people to and try to do it. I just don't know how manageable that would be.
So I'll just mention one thing that we've done after going through one of those tracing exercises is we have asked our employees that are still on site, or if anyone has to come on site for a reason, that they just go to their designated work area and that they not travel throughout the building. Because if you do actually experience one of these where someone is infected and then you have to do the tracing, you will find you have to clean wherever they were when they were showing symptoms. So that's just another reason to sort of keep people within exactly where they're supposed to be. And then that minimizes who they come in contact with. Plus, if you have other measures where there's not that many people here anyway, it's a little easier.
I'd jump in and just say that in terms of having the teams, it really helps being able to minimize exposure to others. And that if you do have to clean, which has happened to us, it's easier to shut down at the end of the night, clean out the building, be ready to go the next day with a fresh team that didn't have that kind of exposure. Not too difficult to trace with a very small team.
So with all of you, those managers who operated by, management by wandering around, those folks really have to change their MO, don't they?
They do. They do.
A lot of Zoom calls for them. In regards to confidentiality, should HR be the only party involved in temperature checking and contract tracing? How does that get deployed inside the organization to maintain confidentiality? Any thoughts there?
I know one institution has actually hired, that's not in the health arena, has actually hired a staff of 5 floating nurses, and they're going to start testing. We have 150 employees. I'm not sure that's the direction we'll go in, but there are resources. Brian or Jill?
Right now, just Human Resources has that information. We're not testing our office employees either, but right now it is HR that has the information in terms of who's tested positive in any of the contact tracing, and we haven't told any of the other departments within the organization.
I just think also, for organizations that may not have people may be wearing multiple hats and might not have a particularly defined HR department. I think it's important to identify who will be the person or the department head that is going to be responsible for this, and then be responsible for the confidentiality of this information.
Got it. So here's a question related to that reduction in hours for exempt employees. And the question is, can you write a new employment contract that both the employer and employee agree on? For instance, if someone's taken a 20% pay cut, does that, and it's accepted by the employee and the employer, it's agreed upon, does that need to be documented?
A couple of things, because I have seen that there are a couple of questions on the issue of reductions for exempt employees. First and foremost, the issue I was talking about before is you can't reduce them for reduced hours in a week, but you can prospectively reduce the salary or what you're paying an exempt employee, so long as it doesn't go below the required salary basis prospectively. And that has to, but you can't be doing it week to week. It has to be for a longer period of time, or an expectation that they're going to have to that pay is not going to come back immediately. It's because of the particular issues you have ongoing for a couple of months or something like that, if you want to be safe about it. As to a contract, you have to look at the particular contract. If somebody is a contracted rate and that's what you've agreed to pay them, I guess technically it could be a breach of contract, but I think, there's a lot of reasonableness that has to go into this, as well as the idea of force majeure and other contract based doctrines that might allow you to make some changes. But yes, you can negotiate it with someone. But remember, a contract amendment to be legally enforceable, there needs to be consideration for both parties.
Got it. And then here's another question. This is related to a previous one we talked about. What if an employee has a compromised immune system, but you have work available for them? And I'm assuming this would mean work in the office, right? This would be a situation where there isn't a work at home option.
So I'll take that, just because the team here has dealt with it multiple times in the past several weeks. We follow the ADA interactive process through this for the most part. And we're taking that very much into consideration, those high-risk individuals. And some of them, if they're just not able to work on site and that's where their job is, they've gone on a leave of absence as well.
Got it. What should we do? And this sort of circles around the testing question. What should we do if an employee is sick, but their doctor either has not or will not test them? Should we require them to stay home? And maybe the larger issue is what support is there coming from the state, and how quick and readily available is this testing that we're all going to need in place? So, but the first question was, do you keep someone at home even if they haven't been tested yet?
We have.
We have two.
Okay. And again, here's another one related to someone refusing to come to work. Is that job abandonment, in which case they would not be eligible for unemployment if someone just says they won't come in? Like, sounds like there's the option of leave, but this is maybe a little more of a confrontational question.
Yeah, I don't know yet how the DUA, Department of Unemployment Assistance, is going to deal with some of these issues. We did have someone who just resigned because she wasn't comfortable due to the health condition that her children had, putting them in emergency daycare, and she was in a clinical role. I have a feeling the state's going to let her collect But we're going to have to see. They ultimately make that decision. I don't know if Brian's aware of sort of the trends that are happening now at the DUA.
With respect to eligibility,
If they leave because they don't feel comfortable coming in, so they basically either get termed or resign because of it.
I haven't heard anything specifically, but again, that would be, in my view, a resignation. However, you got to remember, unemployment is an insurance program in favor of the employees. So, I think it's going to be, particularly under the circumstances we have today, that there'll probably be some leniency or more leniency from the DUA.
That's what I'm expecting.
As to awarding. That's just my crystal ball.
Got it. All right. Well, folks, we are at 1:56, and I'm going to suggest we're going to share all the slides, and I'm going to send the remaining questions we didn't get to our panel, and we'll see if we can maybe follow up with some of those specific ones afterwards, so that everybody gets their questions answered. I want to thank Brian Mullen, Terry Flynn, and Jill LeBeau for a terrific session. Thank you all. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, Bowditch and Dewey, Webster 5, and Fallon Health for helping to bring you this very informative session today. Appreciate all your time, and everybody attending will get follow-up and links and full documentation, and we'll have a video of this session available so you can see all these smiling faces again. There I am. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.